Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. Thank you for coming out today. We are so pleased to have Dr. Joshua Goldstein here to talk about his new book, A Bright Future: How Some Countries Have Solved Climate Change and the Rest Can Follow. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. Let's all take a moment to silence our cell phones. We are recording this event. Also, after Dr. Goldstein speaks, there will be time for audience members to ask questions. When we get to that portion, if you wouldn't mind using the microphone to ask your question so that we can pick it up on the recording, that would be great. Many of you know that we have a lot going on here at P&P, including at our other stores at Union Market and the Wharf. To stay on top of what we're doing, please check out our events calendar and follow us on social media. My name is Jenny. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, and I'm really glad to introduce Dr. Joshua Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein is an award-winning scholar of international relations who has written and spoken widely on war and society, including war's effects on gender, economics, and psychological trauma, and on peace and diplomacy. He is Professor Emeritus of International Relations at AU. Dr. Goldstein's latest book, written with Staffan Qvist, is A Bright Future. A Bright Future is an urgent call to action that also includes a detailed map of the steps necessary for countries to take to combat climate change. A Bright Future looks at innovative strategies now in practice in Sweden, France, South Korea, and Ontario, where in just a couple of decades and without personal sacrifice, people have largely replaced greenhouse-emitting fuels with cleaner alternatives. And now, here's Dr. Joshua Goldstein.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to Politics and Prose for being Politics and Prose and for hosting this event. Back when I was a young environmentalist in California, I didn't like nuclear power at all, and I didn't know anything about climate change. But my attitude towards technology was not so favorable. Back to the land was good, small is beautiful was good, hugging trees was good. Nuclear power I had mixed up with nuclear weapons, which are and were scary and bad and dangerous. And then what happened? I had children. And my oldest child, when he was about 10 years old, became a climate change activist. He's 25 now, and he spent those 15 years hitting me over the head with the fact that for his generation, this is the issue that matters, the only issue that really matters, and that I better get onto that issue. So it convinced me to change my own research program and to start to study climate change with no agenda other than how could we actually solve this problem and leave a livable world for my children and their children. And as I studied it, the first thing I learned was that the world is way off track to solve climate change. And it's not getting any better year by year, I have to say. The climate scientists tell us that in order to get on top of this, we need to rapidly decarbonize the world economy. We need to cut out fossil fuels, which are 85% of the world's energy, in just the next 30 years. And that's a huge undertaking. So far, all we're doing is kind of flattening out our emissions. So we're putting 50 gigatons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere every year. And that, a gigaton is a lot of tons, right, of carbon dioxide, and we don't need to just flatten it out. The Paris Agreement, I'm an international relations professor, the Paris Agreement is our best world agreement where all the countries in the world got together. What's the best we can do? We're going to stop putting so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. All it would do, if every country in the world kept their commitments, by the way, almost none of them are keeping their commitments, all it would do is flatten out that 50 gigatons every year. More carbon dioxide going up, concentrations increasing. What we need to do, according to the climate scientists, is rapidly drop that. And there's nothing really happening that looks like that's going to happen. It's led to a lot of despair, but I hope I can turn some of that despair around today. In order to decarbonize the world economy, we have to do more than just clean up the electric grid. And this is a key piece of the puzzle because electricity generation is only about a quarter of the carbon that's going into the atmosphere. It's after we were to put clean electricity onto the entire world's grid, which I'll talk about in a minute, then we need to also replace fossil fuels in transportation, in building heating, in industrial process. We need to make drop-in fuels that can substitute for gasoline and diesel and all of that. And each of those processes comes back at heart to the need for cheap, clean electricity. If you have really cheap, clean electricity, you can make ammonia and run trucks on it. You can electrify your transportation sector. You can use air source heat pumps and all those wonderful ideas. But without the cheap, clean electricity, that's not going to work. But there's more to it than that, because energy use is growing all the time. And it's a wonderful thing that energy use is growing, because people in poorer countries are using more and more energy year by year and lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. This is really great. You know, the person who's really hot in India and can have an air conditioner will live longer, healthier, happier. Most of the growth of energy in the upcoming decades will be in the poorer countries. And there's no way that people in the richer countries can say to somebody in a poorer country, you can't grow your energy use because we've already used up the carbon budget, so sorry. That's not going to work. We need something that will work, that will provide more energy to the poorer countries of the world. And what we have right now is coal. I have a couple of lumps of it here. It's no coincidence that this is not the thing you want in your Christmas stocking. Right? I'm going to pass it around the room. I put a couple of nice clean lumps of coal. Clean coal is, you know, coal with the word clean put in front of it. So this was clean coal a few weeks ago, and I put it in a bag, and it started to get dusty, and then it started to get oily, and so I put it in a second bag. And if you hold it like this, I think you can pass it around and just pass around the room. This is how we power the world today. This is the thing that's going to give the person in a poorer country the chance for a better life, for more energy. This is also the thing that kills hundreds of thousands of people every year from the particulate matter that's put up into the air. Until we have something better to replace coal, we're not going to decarbonize the world economy. And then when we do all that, the climate scientists say that we should be sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, actually making negative carbon emissions by sometime mid-century. And how are we going to do that? Well, technologies are being developed that could do that, but what do they need? Massive amounts of cheap, clean electricity. So when you add it all up, by mid-century, we need not just today's amount of electricity, but probably 4 to 8 times that much. And we have to come up with it from scratch, and we can't do it with coal. We need something better. And I want to talk a minute about why we can't just put 100% renewables onto the grid and think that we're solving the problem. This is the popular answer. This is what everybody thinks. Just declare 100% renewables, put a lot of solar and wind power. They are getting a lot cheaper, and that's good. But there's 2 reasons that it won't work. And by the way, putting renewables out there is really a great idea. It's the 100% that runs into the problem. First reason is that they're, as you know, variable in their production. And it's not just that the wind comes and goes and the sun goes down at night. That's bad enough. We have no way to store energy. Right now, if you put an electron on the grid, one has to come off the grid somewhere. And if it's a sunny day and all your solar is producing, prices of electricity will go negative. You'll pay people to take it off the grid because there's too much. Then the sun goes down and you have to find electricity from somewhere. And usually we import it from a neighboring state, or we get it from natural gas plants most often. And that's what passes for 100% renewables. You know, too much at the time we don't need it, and not enough when we do need it. And you're not actually substituting out the fossil fuel when you do that. If we had a way to store dirt cheap or free electricity, that would be a different story, but we don't have that now. It's one of the ideas, along with fusion power and tidal power and various ideas, that could be really great in the second half of the century or next century, but we don't have it right now to go to. So that's the first problem. When the sun goes down, stops producing, and not only at nighttime, but often for weeks at a time and sometimes whole seasons at a time. I live in New England. I have solar cells on my house. They're great in the summer. In the winter, they don't produce. So we just have absolutely nothing on the horizon that's going to store grid level, world level, 4 to 8 times today's production for whole seasons at a time. You need something else to put it with. Right now that's methane gas. That's a fossil fuel, natural gas, and it's producing carbon, and it's leaking into the atmosphere where it's 80 times stronger than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. That's not a good solution. The second problem with the 100% renewables is they're slow to put out onto the grid. Now they're growing really fast, but starting from a very small percent of our current energy system. And we've studied what happened when Germany went all out for renewables in the last decade. And they were politically committed to it. They put a lot of money behind it. They're technically capable. And I'm going to give you the short version. You can read the book for the detail. On a per GDP basis, if the world did what Germany has done in the last decade, pouring their heart and soul into building out renewables, the world would decarbonize over about a century and a half. It's slow. They're not very concentrated, and it's slow to get them out there onto the grid. So that's the second problem with the 100% renewables. We go down that path. We think we're moving in the right direction. We are moving in the right direction, but we're not going fast enough to decarbonize in just a few decades. So that brings us to what Sweden did, right next door to Germany. And what Sweden and France did is to build out nuclear reactors. Over just a few decades, France is especially dramatic. They just took the fossil fuel off the grid in 15 years as they ramped up nuclear power instead. And the reason that nuclear power is inherently, potentially much faster than renewables is that it's incredibly concentrated. So the little lump of coal is going around. If you took a pound of coal, turned it to electricity and powered your house, an American house would be powered for about an hour, 1 hour on a pound of coal. If you took a pound of nuclear fuel to power the house, 2 years worth. It's just vastly more concentrated. And it means that it's more scalable. You can get it out there so much faster, the way France and Sweden did. And it also means that the waste streams are much, much smaller for nuclear power than for coal or other fossil fuels. When Sweden put nuclear power onto its grid, it was because they were mostly using hydropower. The environmentalists demanded that the last few free-running rivers not be dammed, and that left it to either build out nuclear power, which was a new thing at that time, several decades ago, or import fossil fuel oil from the Middle East. And that was an uncertain thing. It was the age of the oil embargoes from the Middle East. And so they decided to build out nuclear power. When they did that, electricity became really cheap and really clean. They didn't even know about climate change. It was just in retrospect, turns out that was a really great way to clean up carbon dioxide on the grid. You can look now at who's producing electricity cleanly and more dirtily by looking at a website called electricitymap.org. Electricitymap.org will show you the countries of the world and the regions within the United States and show you grams of carbon dioxide produced for every kilowatt hour of electricity generated. So that's the measure we want to bring down on the electricity side of things. 500 is about where the world is at on average. Coal produces 800 or 900, methane gas produces about 400. And we want to bring it down to about 50, so a tenth of what it is now. And if you look at the map, some countries are green, meaning low carbon emissions, and some are brown, higher carbon emissions. There's a color gradient on the map. So you look around, and all the countries that are green, and consistently green, day in, day out, all the seasons, not related to weather, those countries have one of two things in common. Either they're using hydroelectric power. That would be New Zealand, Brazil, Norway. And that's great. Hydroelectric is clean, it's cheap, it's a great source of electricity unless you happen to live in the place that's being flooded, then it's not so good. But from a world energy perspective, it's a really good source. The trouble is most of the good rivers have already been tapped. There's not that much expansion potential. You're not going to get 4 to 8 times today's total electricity grid out of expanding hydropower. And the other countries that are consistently green, Sweden, France, Ontario, Canada, nuclear power. They're below 50 already. They've already hit the goal of decarbonizing their economy. And they did it without giving up their lifestyle, without, making terrible sacrifices, living in the dark and all that. I mean, you go to Sweden, it's a pretty nice place to live. They have long winters. They heat in the winter. Sweden uses, among the top 10 countries, energy per capita. So this is not energy efficiency that's making them green. It's the nuclear power. And it's about half hydroelectric now and half nuclear power. France is almost entirely nuclear. So that's the lesson. And I compare in the book a German coal plant with a Swedish nuclear plant, not too far away from each other and not too different in their size. And this is the trouble with Germany's renewable strategy is while they're putting on renewables too slowly, they're taking away their nuclear power and they're still burning coal as much as ever. The emissions aren't really coming down after this decade of effort in Germany. If you look down into the coal part of the Germany energy production, this one plant every day uses coal that fills a train 5 miles long. If you made elephants out of coal and marched them into that plant, it would be 10,000 elephants every day, right? And then the equivalent waste streams, the coal ash, the particulate matter that's giving people cancer and emphysema. It kills probably 700 people, that one plant, every year. The Swedish plant, by contrast, you could fit the fuel from that plant on a few trucks and a small waste stream at the other end too. So that's the contrast. Nuclear power, so much more concentrated. And that's what let Sweden and France be so successful with it. Now, nuclear power has a big downside, and that is it scares the heck out of people. Right? People are really afraid about nuclear power. So I want to talk about some of the things that people fear. First of all, safety. It's too dangerous. And even if it isn't too dangerous, it might be too dangerous. Well, so when I started in the 1970s as a young environmentalist, it was pretty new and we were still in the Cold War and we were afraid of nuclear weapons and we had some reasons to be afraid of it. Now it's been around for 60 years. And it has a safety record, and we can compare per kilowatt hour generated, nuclear power is 400 times safer than coal. Coal is the thing that it's going to replace. Coal is the fastest growing energy source in the 21st century. Yeah. Worldwide. I've got the graph in the book. And so that's what we have to take care of. And dangerousness or safety, that's no reason to keep burning coal and not have nuclear power. 400 times safer. In fact, it's the safest of all the energy sources, up there with the renewables, but actually safer than hydroelectric power, which sometimes kills a lot of people when a dam bursts. We've had in history 3 accidents that are emblazoned on our memory. First of all, 3 Mile Island in the United States. There was a containment structure. The radiation stayed within it. Nobody was actually harmed by it. You can quibble whether some cancer case, decades in the future might have been affected by it, but essentially the best guess, nobody was harmed by 3 Mile Island. Very expensive, destroyed the plant. But it came out right when the movie was in the movie theaters, The China Syndrome with Jane Fonda. It was a nuclear power disaster movie, and people cross-wired the two and got really scared about it. The second accident, Chernobyl, that was the serious accident, the one really bad accident in the whole history of the industry where there was not a containment structure. Radiation did escape. People were sent in where they shouldn't have been to try to put out the fire in the plant, and dozens of them died because of that. It was a badly designed plant that we wouldn't make today. It was a government that doesn't exist anymore, the Soviet Union. They tried to lie about it and cover it up. That was a really bad accident and lethal. And the UN agencies all came in to study the radiation that was released and concluded maybe a few thousand people would die of cancer eventually from the radiation release. Now that cancer surge has never really been seen since then, but let's say it's true. Few thousand people. wherever the lump of coal is there, that's killing hundreds of thousands every year. This is one accident 30 years ago, maybe a few thousand people killed. And then you have Fukushima, which is another cross-wiring case. There was a genuine epic natural disaster, fourth worst earthquake in history, and a 50-foot tsunami. And it wiped out everything in Japan, wiped out whole settlements, people, infrastructure, killed almost 20,000 people. And then it damaged this nuclear plant at Fukushima, which was actually nothing to do with the design of the plant, but it was the stupid seawall wasn't high enough for the tsunami, and the backup generators were all located on low ground where they all flooded. And the plant melted down and released some radiation. And there was a panicky kind of evacuation that ensued. It turns out that the radiation released around Fukushima never exceeded the level that we all set for safety levels for medical or occupational exposure to radiation. And this brings up the question about radiation. Like, radiation is not in itself harmful. It's all a matter of dosage. Like, we walk around right now in a soup of radiation. The unit is called millisieverts. We're walking around in about 3 millisieverts usually, but if you're up at altitude living in Denver, then it's 5 millisieverts. If you work at the US Capitol made out of granite, then it's a few millisieverts more because granite is a little bit radioactive. There are hot spots in the world where that level's up to 200 millisieverts. We set that occupational limit at 50. And nowhere outside of the plant in Fukushima was the level higher than 50. That means nobody got a dose high enough to really affect them. And yet, again, we cross-wired in our mind with this true disaster, and all we hear about from Fukushima is the nuclear disaster. There was a disaster and there was a nuclear plant, but it wasn't a nuclear disaster. So it's extraordinarily safe over the long term. Now, another issue people are concerned about with nuclear power is the waste. What are we going to do with the waste? I hear this all the time. You know, it's too bad we can't stop the climate change, you know, from destroying the planet for your children and grandchildren, but after all, we have nothing to do with nuclear waste. And this argument is just a little bit way out of scale. Nuclear waste, I've told you how concentrated the fuel is. The waste is really small. So a big gigawatt nuclear plant will produce about 2 casks, dry casks of nuclear waste, which is what we do with it now. We put it in these casks, 18 feet high, cylinders, and we put it out back. And it sits out there, about 2 of those per year from the plant. The radiation is shielded by the concrete that it's in. I've stood right next to them with no protective gear or anything. They don't leak radiation. They're made out of concrete. Right? Sweden puts it in a big swimming pool. Radiation doesn't go through the water. You can stand right next to it. And they sit out there, and that we've never really had a problem with them. Military nuclear waste is a different matter. They handle it in a very sloppy way, and we have had problems with it. But I'm talking about the civilian plants, casks out back, haven't had a problem, good for at least a century. That's the century when we need to be decarbonizing and solving climate change. Then, in the long term, either we make new reactor designs, which people are working on now, to burn that waste as fuel, or we bury it deep underground the way Finland is doing currently, starting to do. That's the waste problem. If you took all the waste from your entire lifetime of using only nuclear power for electricity, of average American use, it would fit in a soda can, a lifetime of waste. And if you took all the waste from all the America's nuclear plants from 60 years, they would fit on a football field 20 feet high. So it's literally not a big problem. It's a small problem. It's one that can be managed, contained, and it's certainly no reason to burn that coal and kill those hundreds of thousands of people and ruin the planet for the next generation because we're worried about a football field of stuff that we can easily take care of. Now, final big objection about nuclear power, and this is the one that's actually the most daunting, is that it's too expensive. It wasn't too expensive when Sweden and France built those plants. It was cheap. And French electricity today is only a little more than half the cost of German electricity. So think about that. You know, that's facts on the ground. Cheap electricity in France. Sweden got cheap electricity. The early plants that the United States built, cheap electricity. below a nickel a kilowatt hour. That's a good price. Massachusetts right now is closing down our last nuclear plant this year that produces for about 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour, and then we're putting offshore wind. 10 years from now, it's going to cost us 6 or 7 cents a kilowatt hour, which is a good price for offshore wind, and pretty competitive, but it's not as cheap as the nuclear that we have now. So somewhere along the line, it got really expensive to build nuclear plants in the United States and Europe, and the last efforts to do it were prohibitively expensive. 6 times what it cost to build the same thing in South Korea. And why is it so expensive? It's a combination of a couple of things. One, big capital projects have just gotten expensive in general. If you go to build a bridge, a railroad, a nuclear plant, any of this stuff in the United States and Europe, big concrete laying projects, they just always go way over the cost estimate. Not sure why that is, but it's not unique to nuclear power. The second problem is we've been trying to build new designs for the first time. The ones we just had, 4 Westinghouse AP1000 it's called. 4 reactors in the United States, 2 in South Carolina, 2 in Georgia, and 2 of them have already been canceled, and the other 2 are way over budget. They're the first ones ever built. So the first thing off the line is always the most expensive. If you took the first iPhone off the assembly line, it would cost $2 billion, right? But you wouldn't say, nobody's going to pay $2 billion. iPhones don't work, cut it off. Right? That's the first one. So what South Korea and China have done successfully is to build the same thing over and over again. By the way, China just built 4 of those AP1000s and put them on the grid in the last year. So they've leapfrogged us on the very exact same plant that we're trying to build. China and South Korea, same plant, repeated production. That's the secret to bringing down the cost. Somebody said years ago that the difference between France and the United States is that France has 100 kinds of cheese and 2 types of nuclear reactor. And in the United States, the situation is reversed. So we have to get more on the French model. Standardized design around a few versions and roll them off the line more like Boeing jetliners coming off an assembly line and less like building a bridge specific to each site. Ultimately, we want to build them centrally in shipyards or factories where you can really bring the cost down and start building by the hundreds, because we're going to need hundreds of them per year to take up this huge demand in energy. But the good news is we can do that. We already know how to do it. Sweden and France have already done it. That's the bright future we see for the world. Abundant energy for people in the poorer countries, clean energy to stop climate change, and eventually enough energy to start sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and restore stability. And with that, I can look my son in the eyes and say, we're turning over to you a planet worthy of living in for generations to come. Thanks. I think we have microphones that can go around, or they're stationary. The people can come and ask questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I got here a little late, but I guess my question is not so much the electricity, but more like things like process heat and reducing ores to usable metal. I mean, is it nuclear hydrogen to turn out pure iron that you would propose, or what?
Yeah,
what
I was
do you
saying
think for that.
I was mentioned early on that we need to transform the fossil fuel energy to something clean in industry, transportation, building heat, and all those things, and that cheap, clean electricity, which nuclear power is a leading candidate for, could do those things. You use the heat from the reactor, turn seawater into hydrogen, or any water into hydrogen, and then the hydrogen into methane to substitute for natural gas, or into a octane to substitute for gasoline, et cetera, et cetera. So those processes are not entirely developed yet, but with cheap enough electricity, I think that's our best hope for substituting in those things.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering how close to Paris is the nuclear reactor that provides it electric power? Because I'm thinking if someone came with a proposal to put a nuclear reactor that close to Washington, I can only imagine the not in my backyard sentiment for that. And I think it may come from people remembering Chernobyl and the magnitude of the disaster and not weighing that against the more remote probability, and not being convinced of either the probability or the magnitude of continuing with carbon?
Right. Though there's 2 reactors that power Paris. They're right at the edge of the city. They're not far away. And we have twin reactors that power New York City, Indian Point, that's also right close to the city. Those are going to be closed down now, and that's a shame because those are providing safe, clean electricity for New York City. But that's New York State's decision. That was part of a deal to keep reactors open upstate. What you really don't want to be living near is a coal plant. And here the environmental justice issue really does come in, because the coal plant and the coal waste and all of this does tend to go into the poorer communities, and it kills people, the particulate matter. We would have a dilemma if the thing that was unhealthy and dangerous was the thing that could stop climate change and produce clean electricity. But it's not that way. The same thing that's causing the cancer and emphysema, killing hundreds of thousands of people a year, including more than 10,000 in the United States every year, in the poorer communities, that's the same thing that's putting the CO2 into the air, coal. So I would love to have a nuclear power in my backyard, but not a coal plant. And actually, public opinion polling shows that the closer people live to a nuclear plant, the more supportive they are of nuclear power. They understand it better. They may be getting jobs, or indirectly benefiting economically from the plant. And the further away, and specifically the less they know about nuclear power, the more unsupportive they are of it. So it's not so much a not in my backyard problem.
Hello, thank you so much for your time.
Hi.
I was hoping you could speak to more of a policy standpoint, just in light of changing administrations, different views on how, as a nation, we need to view climate change. Do you think realistically it's something that's going to happen at a state level, national level, private level? Just talk a bit more about that.
It has to happen at an international level. That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that. People in the United States are too focused on the United States. And so the first thing I want to say is that half the coal in the world is burned in China. It's a big chunk of the carbon emissions in China. It's just shot up. We're exporting our carbon emissions to China, along with our manufacturing jobs. And so if China were, and I'm getting around to your U.S. question, but I'm an international relations professor. So if China were to take coal off the grid and replace with nuclear power, which they could do right now, I told you, they just put 4 of these reactors on in a year, no problem. That would reduce world carbon emissions by more than 10%. Be the single best thing ever done to address climate change, and one of the few best, few effective things. So that's China. And then India, Indonesia, these other poorer countries, they're very much in the front of the picture. The United States has been making progress by taking off coal and replacing it with natural gas, but you can only do that once, and then you're still left with a lot of emissions from that. Now, here's the good news in the United States. Clean energy actually has a lot of bipartisan support. It's kind of surprising because climate change is so divisive. But if you talk about nuclear power, or for that matter, wind power, there's a lot of bipartisan support for it. And there are a new generation of startup companies that are trying to make new reactors in the United States. I didn't really talk about them, although we could if people want. Those have tremendous support in Congress right now, which just passed a bill to provide support to them, give them access to government facilities to test the reactors and that kind of thing, develop the regulations better to adapt to these new designs. And that passed with big majorities ranging from Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, way on the left, to Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, a climate denier on the other end, But everybody agrees for different reasons. For some it's climate change, and for some it's jobs and American security and that kind of thing. So that's the good news. I think there is an opening there to make progress on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment on the status of fusion energy and its hope. We have almost no nuclear engineers left anymore in the United States. They all stopped 30 years ago, and so that's part of the problem going forward. But
yeah, so that's half true about the nuclear engineers. I was just in Madison, Wisconsin last week and sitting around with a whole room full of young nuclear engineering PhD students. So there's a new generation. There's a gap in the middle. The person showing me around there was in his 40s, I'd say, and he's like, everybody here is either 30 years older than me or 30 years younger than me. Not quite true, but there is a new generation starting in there. So I think that we'll need more, a lot more young nuclear engineers if this is going to work. Fusion energy, the joke about it is it's 30 years in the future and it always will be. But now they say really it is now only 30 years in the future. The international efforts on fusion are centered on this big reactor in Europe that has taken tens of billions of dollars and decades to build, and it's just not very encouraging. But there are some startup companies that are trying to do smaller scale fusion and that are promising. The thing is, and I'm all for it. I think we should go forward with all the research and invest in it, but you wouldn't want to count on it. We don't have it yet. And that's the big difference from looking at the electricity map, and seeing the countries that are already green, the things that already work. We know it works. We have a model that we could stop climate change. Fusion and other great ideas a little bit further out there might be powering the whole world 50 to 100 years from now. It's not the thing that's going to take us down in the next 30 years.
Yeah, I thought your talk was very interesting, but nuclear power relies on uranium, is that correct?
Yeah.
And isn't it true that 60 to 80% of the uranium in the U.S. is found on indigenous lands? And isn't it also true that there are hundreds of mines of uranium that are open or were never properly closed on native lands, and that what you're suggesting for such a reliance on nuclear power will probably have a very adverse effect on indigenous communities in the U.S. as well as in other places in the world?
I would say it could have a mixed effect. If it's done badly, it could have an adverse effect. Some of what you say is true. There have been some adverse effects. But again, the issue is scale. It's much smaller than people imagine because the fuel is so much more concentrated. And then the other point is that you're only talking about American nuclear power, but I'm talking about a worldwide issue. Uranium is found around the world. It's in seawater. There are places to get it that don't involve doing it badly on indigenous lands. And then, again, compared to what? And I always think compared to coal. So my co-author was in Germany visiting a coal mining facility recently. That's brown coal that's near the surface, not the deep coal mines. And he was looking at a pit that was so large it was hard to get an idea of what the scale was until someone told him you could fit the island of Manhattan into this pit with all the skyscrapers. So that's the scale of coal, which also happens in poor communities, indigenous lands, Navajo land. There's a lot of coal there. And nuclear could have some of those same problems, but at a smaller scale.
Hi. I really enjoyed the talk. I actually read the book.
Yeah, thank you.
Already sit down the homework. I haven't finished it, the last couple of chapters, but what I found that you could probably add, not this book is closed, but is the economic point of view of what you say, because you talked about increasing costs, and so I'm saying this is really good, but it's increasing costs and jobs, and so could you help us gauge what would be, for example, in terms of public debt to engage into a complete swap and then pay it over 100 years. The second thing is that I found in a book, which is it's truthful but kind of hidden in footnotes and stuff, is that energy is only one of the big sectors. The other, of course, is agriculture. Agriculture is larger industry, in fact, and 30% to 50%, some estimate, of all greenhouse gases come from agriculture and food. And I think you could have done a better job, not just at emphasizing that, because it seems like, fix this, so we can go home. Not true, I think. But also that, in the fears of nuclear radiation and stuff, people eat a lot of meat. For example, the United States is one of the highest consumer in the world in terms of GDP per capita. It's double the advanced economy consumption of meat, 120 kilos a year. And red meat is the number one carcinogen, like plutonium. So people, they eat the burger and then they're like, oh, please no nuclear plants because it's not, let me have another burger. I just got scared. So I think, really bring home the fact that people are unaware, the fact that they're completely immersed into carcinogens, and that's fine. And they may even know it, but they don't appreciate the fact that there be gains and not bigger risks by doing this.
Okay, so good point about the agriculture. Agriculture and land use, my data are about a quarter of the total carbon emissions. That's a big chunk, something we need to address, and you don't do it by cleaning up the electricity grid, except maybe in little ways like making ammonia for fertilizers from electric fuels or something. But we have a note at the end of the first chapter that you probably saw that says, we need to do all these things for climate change. This book isn't everything. And we haven't talked today about Sweden's carbon tax, a very high tax on emitting carbon dioxide, and that's a really important step to take, operating across the whole environment, the whole economy. But you have to, you can't kind of deal with all of that in one book, and so we focused on electricity because, number one, it's the low-hanging fruit, the easiest piece of emissions to change over, and then number two, a lot of the rest, not including agriculture and land use, can come from cheap, clean electricity. Then we need to do a lot of afforestation, change agricultural practices, put seaweed into the feed of cattle so that they don't burp methane gas and all these other things. So we need to do everything. This is a crisis. And I don't want to imply that it's, you do one thing and it's done. So on the economics you asked about, your question on that again was...
So, to get a sense, these are big investments, and how much more, of nuclear energy we need, and what's in the scale of...
Talk about that at the end of the book, the chapters you haven't read yet. But, but there's two issues that are related, but they're kind of separate. And one is, how cheap can you produce a kilowatt hour of electricity? And we know how to do that pretty well with nuclear power plants. But the other issue is, how much does it cost up front to build a nuclear plant? And that's what's gotten out of control. But even when we get it into control, like what the South Koreans do, for 1/6 what we pay, it's still billions of dollars up front for something that's going to produce revenue for 60 to 80 years. And so without some kind of government involvement, it's hard to do that in a deregulated economy. Depending what your discount rate is, I don't want to get technical, but how much do you care about the money you're going to make 50 years from now? Most companies will say, not much. The shareholders care what I'm making right now. And so cheaper and quicker to build other sources. Most places that nuclear power has succeeded, there's been some government involvement, either private, public, or just all government. And it raises the question whether we should think about energy infrastructure more like we think about the highway system or other critical national infrastructure, and not just throw it out to the market and deregulate it all and say, whoever wants to put electricity on the grid, first come, first serve, and no charge to put carbon in the atmosphere. So, okay.
How can we educate everyone, as to some of the points you've raised in this book and lots of other issues that, it just feels like our population and most populations are just so deficient when it comes to knowledge about these issues. That's all I want to say.
Well, education is a great thing. On this topic of nuclear power, people are afraid, and when people are afraid and traumatized, they don't learn well, and that's especially my generation that was traumatized by nuclear weapons, hiding our heads under the desk, waiting for the world to end. That's not a good environment for learning. There's one guy who completely flipped nuclear power opinion in the Netherlands, and it's a comedian, late-night comedian, Lubach. He did 20 minutes on his show, which is like The Daily Show or one of these, weekly comedy shows. And he interspersed education with humor. And so it got around people's fears, like with the waste issue. He said, you could live your whole life on nuclear power and the waste would fit in an apple. He had a little clip of somebody saying that. And then he says, I don't know if I'd want to eat that apple. And then everybody's like, oh yeah, and then he says, oh wait, it's a uranium delicious, it's good, and so then everybody laughs, a little nervous laughter like here, and then they're open to receiving information. So I think we could be a lot smarter. One thing that doesn't work well is what the US nuclear industry does, which is to tell you 10 times in a row how safe it is. And after the 10th time, you're like, if it must be really dangerous for you to tell me 10 times in a row how safe it is. So I think that normalizing the discussion, all the different fuels, they all have pluses and minuses, nuclear included. This is a proven way. We should definitely be having it on the agenda. We should be talking about it in a kind of a normal way and not a freaked out way. That's my high aspiration for the discussion.
Yeah, what about potential consequences of military or terrorist attack? Is that or should that be a consideration?
It's not a big concern of mine. We all think of, terrorists will fly an airplane into a nuclear plant. That turns out that would be a really stupid idea because unlike an office tower, it's a block of concrete, the containment vessel, and the airplane is really thin-skinned and would basically disintegrate when it hit it. Most of the important stuff is underground, below ground level anyway. And then we worry that terrorists are going to get their hands on material and turn it into a bomb, and that would be just ludicrously hard to do it's something you can do if you're a government and you have a lot of money and a lot of trained people and big infrastructure and big facilities, the way North Korea has done. The countries that have made nuclear weapons outside of the international controls, like North Korea and Israel, generally don't even have nuclear power, civilian nuclear power. And those that do, like Pakistan, have nuclear power over on one side and whole separate operation to produce plutonium for their bombs. It's more efficient that way. So we haven't seen where civilian nuclear power has been a factor in proliferation of nuclear weapons to new countries. And we have very strong international controls that come in and track everything in the world nuclear industry, put in cameras and seal up canisters and all these preventive measures. And so far those have worked. If we had a big expansion of nuclear power in the world, you'd want probably more of that, more cameras, more intrusion. But so far that's working. Yep.
Is there a body that's regulating this nuclear reactors, and if the poorer countries have to develop their reactors, then there should be some kind, I don't know if there should be like an international body or local bodies that are strong in regulating those, because I'm just concerned about the nuclear waste. If it is not contained in a right manner and if there's a leakage, sorry if I'm ignorant in that way, but if there's a leakage and it's even more trouble for the entire globe, because if a country like India, we have 1.4 billion people, it's going to be too many football fields of nuclear waste.
Well, yeah, there is a body that regulates nuclear industry worldwide, the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's a wing of the UN, and they've been effective so far. And then there's a group called the World Nuclear Association that coordinates among countries. India is part of both of those bodies. I wouldn't worry too much about the football fields. This is the one football field here is 60 years of the United States. We have about 100 reactors running. So India has a long way to go to get to just that first football field. The smaller countries, you don't want every little country in the world to develop a nuclear industry. What you really need is the big carbon emitting countries, starting with China, as I said, and then especially the Indias that are coming on strong, using a lot more energy, to not go down the coal route as they build that out, but to go to something else. It has to be something cheaper and more practical, though. It can't be something more moral, don't use coal because that's bad, But use something twice as expensive, that's not going to work. So that's why we need this sort of scaled up production where nuclear power can compete head to head and be cheaper than coal, and then it's the no-brainer for some plant manager in Vietnam that I'm not going to build this coal plant, I'm going to build a nuclear plant. It's cheaper.
This is it's a great segue to my question. What are the chances, in your opinion, as a foreign relations expert, that China, and for that matter India, will follow this sort of game plan of going heavily into nuclear power? You mentioned that China has done a couple of things just here recently. Do you have any sense of what their sort of long-range thoughts are about nuclear power versus their coal, which they're burning fast?
Yeah. China's still burning coal and still increasing its coal. I mean, it's coming down. They're trying to level it out, but they're not getting rid of it fast. But they're thinking about it, and they're thinking about nuclear power very seriously. They had 19 reactors under construction at once last year, the most of any country in the world, and now a few of those have been finished. But what they're doing right now is they've got some of our US design reactors, they've got some European reactor, they just put the first one of those online. They've got some Chinese indigenous similar reactors, kind of based on the South Korean one. They've got some of these new designs like our startups are making. They've got floating reactors, they've got small reactors, sort of trying a bunch of stuff. What they haven't done yet is to say, we're going to pick one or two of these and stamp them out, by the dozens and then the hundreds, and really get rid of the coal. They need to do that, but if only because of make the air in the cities breathable.
Right.
So they have a good incentive that's, aside from climate change. And then they want to make themselves the leaders on climate change. So they've got several good incentives to do this, but they just haven't quite decided yet to do that. And will they or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
I sure hope so. I mean, sometimes I say, like, the one person I hope reads my book is Xi Jinping.
Right, yeah. Send him a free copy.
I was in San Diego on Monday and had dinner opposite the nuclear power aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt. And, I was thinking to myself, this is a floating nuclear power plant. How safe, what if a ship sinks or a terrorist ignites, what we saw with the coal? I mean, how safe are the nuclear power, nuclear assets on these ships, the submarines? What kind of redundancies are in place to make sure that even if these things sink, you haven't, detonated a nuclear bomb in the ocean?
Well, the U.S. Navy has hundreds of reactors floating right now. We don't think about them much, just like we don't think about the 400 civilian reactors around the world, because hardly anything ever happens. The Navy has had 6,000 reactor hours of operation now with no radiological incident. So I say that's pretty safe. The only trouble with the Navy model is they're expensive because it's the Navy, right? So otherwise I'd say just build what they're building. I'll have what they're having. But probably you need something cheaper. Navy's going to build in a lot of expensive stuff to make it really safe, and they are really safe.
But we also haven't had a naval altercation. It's been naval.
Go to the mic.
A naval battle.
We haven't had any naval battles. It's true. That's a good thing. Not significant, no.
Was there one in the harbor?
Could you repeat the question is, were there leaks from Navy ships? To my knowledge, there's never been any serious radiological incident at all with the U.S. Navy. There were several some decades ago with the Soviet Union. It's the same as the civilian plant at Chernobyl. They were fast and loose with it, and there were some. And I think I mentioned the U.S. military has done a bad job of cleaning up after their sites. Hanford, Washington, Rocky Flats in Colorado. Those are bad operations. You wouldn't want to live next to those.
There's been a lot of press recently for the Green New Deal. There have been people. I have a friend who works with the Citizens Climate Lobby, pushing a carbon tax. There's other groups out there that are trying to mobilize support for their viewpoints and trying to get them into the public sphere. You've written the book, but has any groups approached you, or do you know of any groups that are behind this, that have mobilized to try to use this as a way to accelerate the decarbonization of the economy? And if you could share that and figure out, like, who do we affiliate ourselves with to try to push this?
Yeah, there are some groups out there trying to push in this direction, but there's not kind of a big citizen movement yet doing that. The Green New Deal is a great opportunity because it's still up for grabs what it really means. Like, we all like that idea. Put a lot of energy into greening the economy really quickly. And nuclear power has not been ruled out from that. But there's one wing of the people who are supporting it that are trying to rule out nuclear power, and also rule out carbon capture and storage, and also rule out carbon pricing, as I understand it, and just like only do renewables. And I think that's a terrible idea, but that hasn't been set in stone yet. So there are these discussions going on right now in the Democratic Party especially. There's going to be a committee to work out what this Green New Deal really means, and it could mean nuclear power as part of that. There are certainly prominent Democrats, Cory Booker, Sheldon Whitehouse, people like that, who are pro-environment, pro-solving climate change, and pro-nuclear power as part of the solution to that.
We have time for this one more question.
Yeah.
So what makes nuclear power so expensive? So the price of everything over the last 50 years went down a lot.
Yeah.
The price of nuclear power is the same. So what is expensive is the plant itself, the concrete, the fuel. What exactly is expensive there?
Yeah, it's not the fuel. The fuel is the cheapest thing.
Right.
It's building the plant that's expensive, the big concrete build. And part of that is all the big concrete kind of projects have gotten really expensive. That's a combination of bureaucratic things and regulatory things and so forth. But then a big factor in nuclear power is we regulate it extremely tightly, thousands of times more than any other fuel, even though it's actually safer than the other fuels. So I've seen examples of like a bolt from the hardware store used in a power plant, and it costs $20. But if you try to put it into a nuclear plant, it's going to cost $20,000 because all the paperwork that has to go into certifying that bolt is going to be for a nuclear plant. So that's a big piece of it. Right now, to take a new design for a nuclear plant and bring it to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and get it approved costs $1 billion in a decade. Just to go through all that process.
So the paper itself is $1 billion.
Paper itself is $1 billion. And then you don't know if you're going to get approved or not. So that's part of this effort in Congress on the new reactors to streamline the process. It's safe. You want to make sure it stays safe, but streamline it where we can actually build things and get the dirty fuel off of our grid. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. If you haven't purchased a book yet, the book is behind the register, so purchase a copy. You can meet us right up here and line up going back toward the register for the signing. Thank you.
Thanks.
There is actually a nuclear plant in the neighborhood. Calvert Cliffs is on this side of the Chesapeake Bay. Probably the same. As Western Bay or whatever.